The first mistake was agreeing to go camping alone with her. The second was forgetting to check the weather, letting a storm turn the forest into a freezing lake. The biggest mistake was packing only one sleeping bag. Built for one person. Rain hammered the tent. Wind tore at the nylon. Emma's wet hair brushed my chin. Her warm breath mixed with the storm. She turned toward me and whispered, "Are you awake?" I didn't answer right away. At 32, I knew one wrong answer could ruin 12 years of friendship. My name is Ryan Carter. Structural engineer. Denver. For 12 years, I kept one rule. Never let her know I loved her. I am 32 years old, and most people who know me would describe me the same way. Calm. Responsible. The guy who solves problems with logic instead of feeling. The guy who hates being a burden to anyone. There's a reason for that. My father left when I was young. My mother worked 3 jobs just to keep the lights on. I grew up believing one simple, unbearable truth. The people you love eventually leave. So I built my whole life around distance. Careful, measured, controlled distance. I chose a career where every load, every stress point, every foundation had to be calculated exactly. I liked things that couldn't surprise me. Emma Brooks was the one exception I never planned for. She's 31. An elementary school teacher. The kind of person who laughs with her whole body, who hikes mountains on weekends just to watch the sunrise, who fills every phone gallery with pictures nobody else would think to take. Cracked sidewalks. Strange clouds. Dogs wearing tiny raincoats. We met in college, at the worst possible moment for a first impression. I was carrying a stack of textbooks across the quad when the whole pile slipped out of my arms and scattered across the sidewalk. Emma was walking past. She crouched down, helped me gather them, and looked up at me with a grin that I still remember clearly, more than a decade later. "If you build bridges as clumsy as this," she said, "I am never driving over one." That line became a running joke between us for the next 12 years. Every time I finished a project, she'd send a single text. "Did you drop it first?" I always replied the same way. Every single time. We became inseparable in a way that neither of us ever tried to explain out loud. We studied together through finals week, worked part-time jobs at the same coffee shop just so we could carpool, and somehow ended up as each other's emergency contact before either of us had an actual emergency. When I got sick with a bad fever during our senior year, Emma showed up at my apartment with soup, medicine, and a stubborn refusal to leave until my temperature came down. When her college boyfriend broke things off at 2 a.m., I drove across town in the middle of the night without a single question, just to sit with her on her porch steps until sunrise. We always showed up for each other's worst days. Neither of us ever called when something good happened. I never noticed the pattern until years later. Good news always made me want to hear her voice too much, and hearing her voice too much felt dangerous. We were, without question, the most important person in each other's lives. And we called it, with total confidence, nothing more than friendship. Just best friends, Emma would say, whenever anyone asked. Just best friends, I would repeat, like a rule I needed to keep saying out loud to believe it. The camping trip was Emma's idea, the way most good ideas in my life started with her. She brought it up on a Tuesday evening, calling me while I was still finishing paperwork at the office. "This weekend," she said. "Just us. The lake and the mountains. No excuses." I told her I was busy. I had a deadline. I had reports to finish. I had every reasonable, adult reason to say no. "You'll regret it when you're old," she said, laughing. "Imagine turning 60 and realizing you spent your best years reviewing spreadsheets instead of watching stars with your best friend." I smiled, even though she couldn't see it through the phone. "Fine," I said. "One weekend. You say that like it's a sacrifice. It is. I have a very important relationship with my office chair. She laughed, the sound warm even through the phone, and just like that, the trip was decided. On the drive up, Emma fell asleep less than an hour in, her head slowly drifting until it landed against my shoulder. I kept both hands steady on the wheel and pretended not to notice, the way I always pretended not to notice things when it came to her. Halfway through the drive, she stirred awake just long enough to mumble something with her eyes still closed. "If the tent blows away," she said, half asleep, "don't you dare steal the blanket." I laughed quietly and kept driving, the mountains rising ahead of us, gray and endless against the afternoon sky. We set up camp beside the lake just before sunset, and within minutes we were arguing, the way we always argued, easily and without any real heat behind it. "You're pitching it the wrong direction," Emma said, watching me struggle with the tent poles. "The wind's coming from the ridge." I have a degree in structural engineering. Structural engineering for buildings that don't move, Ryan. This is a tent. It's basically origami with anger issues. Paper engineer, she added, grinning, when the whole thing sagged sideways on my first attempt. I rebuilt it properly the second time, if only to prove her wrong, though she never let me forget the first collapse. She took a photo of the crooked version before I could tear it down, insisting she needed evidence for future arguments. "This is going in my phone forever," she said. "Right next to the picture of you falling off that kayak in Utah. That kayak was defective." "The kayak was fine, Ryan. You just panicked when a duck swam past." I didn't have a good answer for that one, mostly because she was right. Dinner went about as well as the tent. I oversalted the pasta so badly that even the lake water probably tasted better, but Emma ate every bite anyway, valiantly, without complaint, until I finally caught her wincing between mouthfuls. "You don't have to finish that," I said. "I absolutely do not," she agreed, already laughing, "but I respect your effort too much to admit that out loud. You could just say it's bad. And ruin your confidence forever? Absolutely not. I'm protecting your ego. It's a sacrifice I'm willing to make. That's the worst kind of loyalty. It's the only kind I have." We laughed until neither of us could breathe properly, the kind of laughter that only happens with someone who has seen every unflattering version of you and stayed anyway. Later, while I was cleaning a smear of dirt off my cheek, Emma reached over with a napkin before I could finish the job myself. Her hand moved carefully, wiping the mark away, her eyes focused on my face with a kind of attention I wasn't used to receiving from her. "Hold still," she murmured, tilting my chin slightly with 2 fingers. "You've had that there since dinner and I've been debating whether to mention it. You could have just told me. And miss an excuse to touch your face? Absolutely not." I went completely still. Something about the way she said it, light and joking on the surface, didn't quite match the careful way her fingers lingered a second longer than the task required. She didn't seem to notice. Or maybe she did, and simply didn't say anything. Afterward, we sat by the fire, and Emma stared out at the darkening lake for a long moment before speaking. "Being here with you," she said quietly, "anywhere feels like home." The word landed somewhere I wasn't prepared for. "Guess you've never stayed at a 5-star hotel," I said, deflecting with a joke, the way I always deflected. She laughed it off. But inside, I knew something had shifted. 12 years, and that was the first time she had ever used that particular word. The storm rolled in faster than either of us expected. One minute the sky was simply dark, the next it had opened completely, wind ripping at the tent stakes, rain falling sideways in freezing sheets. "You said low chance of rain," I shouted over the wind, grabbing our packs before they slid toward the lake. "I said there was a chance," Emma shouted back, fighting to keep the tarp from flying off. "That's basically the same thing as certainty." It is not the same thing at all. Argue with me about semantics later. Grab the cooler. We scrambled to grab what we could, both of us soaked within seconds, laughing despite the chaos because laughing was somehow easier than panicking. But by the time we got everything secured, one of the sleeping bags had already soaked through completely, useless, ruined at the seam where the rain had pooled against the tent wall. Only one dry sleeping bag remained. I offered it to her immediately. She refused just as fast. "You'll catch a cold," Emma said, arms crossed, teeth already chattering. "I'm a grown man. I'll survive." "Grown men catch colds too, Ryan. I have a strong immune system." "You had a cold in July. In the desert." "That was an isolated incident." We argued for a solid 5 minutes, both of us shivering, both of us equally stubborn, neither willing to budge, until a crack of lightning lit up the entire tent and Emma's teeth clicked together hard enough to end the debate on its own. There was no argument left to have. There was only the storm, the cold, and one sleeping bag built for a single person. We climbed in together. Neither of us slept. The rain kept falling. The tent stayed dark. Our shoulders pressed together in the cramped space, our knees bumping every time either of us shifted, our breathing close enough that I could hear every small change in hers. I stared up at the shape of the tent ceiling, trying to focus on anything other than the warmth of her back against my chest, the way her hair still smelled faintly of cedar smoke even after the rain had soaked through everything else. Then, quietly, Emma turned toward me. "Are you awake?" she whispered. I stayed silent for a moment. Every part of me wanted to say no. Wanted to fake sleep, let the moment pass, wake up in the morning with everything exactly the way it had always been. Instead, I said the only word that felt honest. "Yeah." "I knew it," she whispered back, a smile in her voice even in the dark. "You talk too much. You like it." I didn't argue, because she wasn't wrong. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Depends if it involves my cooking." "It does not involve your cooking." "Then proceed." For a while we lay there in silence, listening to the storm, until Emma asked a question that caught me off guard. "Do you remember Sarah?" I did. Sarah was the last person I had let myself get close to, years ago, before I quietly gave up trying. She told me once, I admitted, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent, that being with me made her feel invisible. Like I took up space without ever really being present. I hadn't said that out loud to anyone before. Not even to Emma. "I never tried again after that," I said. "Not really. It felt easier to just be the reliable one. The guy who shows up, fixes things, and doesn't ask for anything back." "You were never invisible to me," Emma said quietly. "I noticed everything about you. I just never told you that." Emma was quiet for a moment. Then she offered something back, a piece of herself in exchange for the piece I had just handed her. "My last boyfriend used to get jealous of you," she said. "He made me choose. Cut you off completely, or he was gone." "What did you choose?" "I chose to break up with him," she said simply, like it had never really been a difficult decision at all. "I never told you that was the real reason," she added. "I let you think it was something else. Something smaller." "Why?" "Because if I told you the truth, I would have had to admit why it mattered so much to me. And I wasn't ready to admit that. Not yet." The rain softened slightly overhead. Emma's hand found mine somewhere in the dark, her fingers slipping between mine, deliberate, not by accident. "I never stopped choosing you," she whispered. I went completely still. "What do you mean?" I asked, though some part of me already understood exactly what she meant. "I mean every time I dated someone else, I compared them to you without meaning to. Every single time. And they always came up short, and I never understood why until I stopped pretending I didn't know." Her voice was steady, but I could feel her hand trembling slightly in mine. "I think I've loved you," she said, since college. Maybe longer. I just never let myself say it. I let out a short laugh, more disbelief than humor. 12 years, I said. 12 years of me trying so hard to hide it. She smacked my shoulder lightly. You too? Yeah, I said. Me too. Since when? Does it matter? It absolutely matters. I need the timeline for my records. Freshman year, I admitted. The book pile. She went quiet for a second, then laughed softly into the dark. That entire time? You let me date other people that entire time? I was protecting the friendship. You were being a coward. I prefer strategic patience. 12 years of strategic patience, Ryan. For a moment neither of us said anything else. The storm outside felt distant now, like it belonged to some other night, some other version of us who hadn't said any of this out loud yet. Outside, the wind had softened into something almost gentle, the storm finally losing its grip on the mountain. I could hear the lake settling, small waves lapping quietly against the shore, patient and steady, the way it had probably sounded every night for 100 years before we ever showed up with our 2 backpacks and 1 working sleeping bag. What happens now? Emma asked, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. Now, I said, I stop being an idiot. She laughed quietly. That's going to take some adjustment. I'm aware. I've built my entire personality around teasing you for being emotionally unavailable. This changes my whole comedy routine. You'll adapt. You're resourceful. I really am. I found her hand fully in the dark and held it. I choose you, I said. Not because of this sleeping bag. Not because of the storm. Because if I let you slip away one more time, I know I'll regret it for the rest of my life. Emma didn't say anything right away. I felt her fingers tighten around mine instead, her answer arriving in the only way that felt like enough. Then she shifted closer, close enough that I could feel her heartbeat through the thin space between us, close enough that whatever distance we had spent 12 years carefully maintaining had simply stopped existing somewhere in the last few minutes. 12 years, she whispered again, almost to herself. We really wasted 12 years. We didn't waste them, I said. We just needed a storm to catch up to where we already were. The kiss, when it finally happened, was clumsy in every possible way. Cold noses. Tangled arms. Both of us laughing halfway through it because neither of us had ever imagined our first kiss happening inside a sleeping bag during a thunderstorm. This is not how I pictured this, Emma admitted, still laughing against my mouth. You pictured this? Occasionally. In my defense, none of my versions involved this much nylon. The rain hadn't even stopped yet. By morning, my arm had gone completely numb beneath her, and Emma woke up laughing at the sight of me trying to shake feeling back into my fingers. Who volunteers to be someone's free pillow, she teased, and then complains about it. I didn't complain. I suffered silently. That's worse. That's romantic. That's you trying to make numb nerve damage sound romantic. She kissed my jaw before I could argue back, which effectively ended the conversation in her favor. We both admitted the same quiet truth over breakfast, eaten cold and slightly burnt beside the dying fire. This hadn't happened because of the storm, or the ruined sleeping bag, or bad luck with the weather app. We had simply been circling this for years, waiting for a reason brave enough to finally land. Back in Denver, I asked her out properly, the old-fashioned way. I bought flowers 3 separate times before finally deciding on one bouquet. I changed my shirt 3 times before our actual date, which Emma later admitted she'd guessed correctly, though she pretended otherwise the entire evening. You look nervous, she said when I picked her up, leaning against her doorway with a grin she clearly wasn't trying very hard to hide. I'm not nervous. I'm being thorough. You've known me for 12 years. That's exactly why I'm nervous. We ate at the same small restaurant where we used to study for finals in college, trading old memories back and forth across the table like it was the easiest thing in the world. She stole half my dessert without asking, the way she always had, except this time she kissed my cheek afterward instead of just laughing about it. "That's new," I said. "Get used to it," she said. "I plan on doing it a lot." At one point, Emma admitted her biggest fear out loud. "What if one day," she said, turning her water glass slowly between her hands, "we go back to just being friends?" "No," I said, without hesitation. "From now on, the only thing I know how to be is your partner." Our friends found out almost immediately. A group chat appeared within hours, filled with messages that all landed on the same sentiment. Finally. It only took them 12 years. Our first real argument came a few weeks later, when I hid the fact that I was overworking myself, buried under a deadline, avoiding her calls instead of just telling her the truth. Emma got upset, not because of the deadline, but because I had chosen silence over honesty, the exact habit I had spent my whole life protecting. "You can't just disappear when things get hard," she said, standing in my kitchen with her arms crossed. "That's not how this works anymore." I wasn't disappearing. I was handling it. Handling it alone isn't handling it, Ryan. It's hiding. I didn't have a quick answer for that one. She was right, and we both knew it. I apologized. We talked it through properly, the way we hadn't quite learned to yet. Slowly, we started teaching each other the same simple lesson. Say the real feeling out loud, even when it's uncomfortable, instead of disappearing into silence. "I'm overwhelmed," I told her the next time work got heavy, testing the words out loud for what felt like the first time in my life. "Not gone. Just overwhelmed." Emma's whole face softened. "That," she said, "I can work with." 1 year later, we drove back to the same campsite. The same lake. The same wide, familiar sky stretching over the ridge. This time, we checked the weather forecast 3 separate times before leaving, and Emma had insisted on calling a park ranger just to confirm it herself, refusing to trust an app after what had happened the last time. "I'm not taking any chances," she said, tucking her phone away. Some of us learned our lesson. Some of us bought a second sleeping bag. Some of us overcorrected slightly. This time, I packed differently. 2 sleeping bags. 2 flashlights. 2 folding chairs. 2 rain jackets, just in case the sky decided to test us twice. Emma looked at the pile of gear stacked in the back of my truck and raised an eyebrow. "You went a little overboard, didn't you?" "I don't intend to make the same mistake twice," I said. That night, as the fire burned low and the stars came out over the water, Emma leaned into my shoulder the way she had 100 times before, except now there was nothing careful or hidden about it. "Do you ever think about that first night?" she asked, watching the flames. "Every time I see a weather app." She laughed, nudging me with her elbow. "I mean it. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't asked?" "You would have asked eventually. You've never been able to keep a thought to yourself for more than an hour." "That's fair," she admitted. "But what if you had said no that night?" I thought about it for a moment, watching the fire settle into embers. "I don't think I was capable of saying no to you. Not that night. Not any night, really. I just needed 12 years and 1 bad storm to admit it." We climbed into the tent together, not long after. 2 sleeping bags waited on the ground beside us, exactly as planned. We zipped only one open. Emma turned toward me in the dark, the same way she had a year earlier, and smiled. "Are you awake?" she whispered. This time, I didn't hesitate. "Always," I said. I understood then that the question had never really been about sleep. It had never simply meant, "Are your eyes open?" It meant something far more honest. "Is your heart still open to me?" A year ago, I chose silence because I was terrified of losing my best friend. Now, I choose to speak, because I finally understand that the best kind of love is often already standing right beside you, quietly waiting for someone brave enough to say it out loud. We sat by the fire that night, watching the stars scatter across the sky above the lake. Even with 2 sleeping bags packed and ready, we only ever zipped one closed, a small reminder that some distances only take one brave night to disappear forever. Somewhere out on the dark water, a loon called once and went quiet. Emma tucked herself closer against my side, and neither of us said anything else. We didn't need to. After 12 years of almost silence between us had finally stopped feeling like distance, and started feeling like exactly where we were supposed to be. If you've ever quietly loved a best friend, would you have the courage to finally say it out loud? Share your story in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and join our membership for more heartfelt stories like this one.